There are places on Earth where the rules we trust most time, gravity, even the pull of the air in our lungs, seem to change without warning. In the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains, hikers vanish where trails should lead them home. Radios cut out in clear weather. Compasses spin in silent valleys. And sometimes the landscape itself appears to move sideways, upward, or not at all. Here, search teams walk for days, only to find a single footprint or a neatly stacked backpack with no one around to claim it. Scientists search for answers in geology, weather, and magnetic fields. Yet explanations dissolve as quickly as the fog that hides these hills. What remains is a wilderness that seems to obey a logic entirely its own patient, silent, and watching. Join us as we explore the Smoky Mountains National Park, where nature doesn't just surround you, it rewrites the rules. The bridge that wasn't there. In late September 2015, two friends from Atlanta, 3 6-year-old urban planner Henry Chen and 3 4-year-old environmental science teacher Laura Myers, set off for a 3-day backpacking trip in one of the more remote corners of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Their plan was simple: follow the Deep Creek Trail north from the Nolan Divide, cross a narrow wooden bridge that spanned Forney Run, then loop back along an old fire road to their starting point. They were both experienced hikers, equipped with lightweight gear, water filtration, and a GPS tracker. By all accounts, they should have returned by Sunday evening. They never did. The first part of their trip was uneventful. Witnesses recalled seeing them on the trail on September 26, cheerful and unhurried. They camped that night near Jonas Creek without incident. On the morning of September 27, they texted a photo of themselves from a ridgeline, clearing their last known communication. Later analysis of their phone data placed them on the approach to Forney Run around 2:17 p.m. The trail sign there clearly indicated a footbridge 0.3 miles ahead, a standard park installation built in the 1982nd and inspected annually. But according to search teams who later retraced their steps, there was no bridge, and perhaps there hadn't been one for quite some time. Rangers were baffled. The official maps showed the crossing. GPS waypoints confirmed its coordinates. Even maintenance logs referenced its last inspection less than a year earlier. Yet when crews arrived, the structure was gone, not collapsed into the water, not washed downstream, but simply absent. The river was too deep to ford safely, especially at that time of year. And yet, 2 days later, searchers found Henry and Laura's backpacks on the opposite bank, propped neatly against a tree. There were no footprints in the mud, no signs of a fallen tree or makeshift crossing. Even dogs brought to the site showed confusion pacing back and forth along the waterline, circling repeatedly before losing the scent entirely at the edge of the creek. It was as if the pair had walked across open air. This was not the first time strange anomalies had been reported in that valley. Park rangers and botanists working in the Forney watershed had long noted that oxygen levels there sometimes dropped below expected concentrations, not dangerously low, but significantly less than atmospheric averages for the region. Researchers attributed this to a rare microclimate effect caused by cold air pooling in the basin and a phenomenon known as katabatic drainage, where heavier cold air flows downhill at night, displacing warmer layers and creating isolated zones of reduced oxygen concentration near the forest floor. At those lower levels, humans often experience mild but measurable cognitive effects: disorientation, impaired judgment, a warped sense of distance and space. Most hikers never notice anything more than slight fatigue. But in some rare cases, disorientation leads to strange behavior, sudden detours from the trail, wandering without memory of doing so, or stepping into areas that seem familiar but are not. There is evidence that Henry and Laura may have entered such a state. Forensic analysis of their last GPS transmission, a breadcrumb signal from Laura's smartwatch, showed a series of slow, looping movements within 100 feet of the creek. Instead of a straight path toward the bridge, they appeared to have circled the same small area for nearly 40 minutes, stopping and starting as though unsure of their direction. The final ping ended abruptly at the water's edge. Searchers expanded their grid far downstream, convinced they had been swept away, but days of dragging and sonar scans found no bodies. Weeks later, a fisherman reported finding a hiking pole lodged in a logjam nearly 3 miles away. It matched Henry's gear. Beyond that, nothing. Scientists who studied the case pointed to a phenomenon known as spatial compression illusion, sometimes documented in high-altitude or low-oxygen environments. In such states, the human brain can misjudge depth and distance, causing objects or even empty space to appear closer than they are. Witnesses might see a crossing where none exists, or misinterpret reflections on water as solid ground. If Henry and Laura were experiencing even mild hypoxia from the microclimate's oxygen pocket, it could explain why they may have attempted an impossible crossing. There was also an unusual atmospheric condition recorded in the valley that afternoon. Portable weather stations installed nearby detected a temperature inversion, a sudden reversal, where colder air remained trapped near the ground while warmer air hovered above. These inversions not only affect oxygen levels, but also distort visual perception by bending light through stratified layers of air, sometimes creating what meteorologists call false horizons. It is possible the hikers believed they saw the bridge exactly where the sign said it would be, even though it was no longer there. To this day, no one knows what happened between the moment Henry and Laura reached the bank and the moment their packs were discovered on the opposite shore. No bodies, no clothing, and no personal items have ever surfaced. The footbridge has since been rebuilt, but older rangers, wary of the strange microclimate, advise hikers not to linger too long in the valley when temperatures dip. Today, the Forney Run crossing remains one of the park's most quietly discussed mysteries. Not because it is the site of an accident, but because of the possibility that something subtler, almost invisible, may have guided two people to step where no ground existed. Whether their disappearance was the result of a physical miscalculation, a perceptual distortion, or a momentary failure of the senses brought on by the mountain's thin, shifting air, no one can say. The bridge stands once more, sturdy and real. But those who cross it still glance at the water below, imagining the moment Henry and Laura might have taken a final step forward, not into wood and steel, but into a space where the line between perception and reality blurred and vanished like the bridge itself. The meadow where the radios died. On the afternoon of the 14th of June 1969, the Smoky Mountains were alive with the sounds of summer wind brushing through the tulip poplars, streams echoing through the valleys, and the distant hum of ranger radios crackling with static. But by dusk, in a place known as Spence Field, those radios would fall silent, and a 6-year-old boy named Dennis Lloyd Martin would vanish into the landscape as if the forest itself had swallowed him whole. The Martin family's plan was simple. Clyde and William Martin had brought their sons, Douglas and Dennis, on a Father's Day weekend trip, a hike along the Appalachian Trail, and a night of camping beneath the high canopy. They left Cades Cove early, climbed through switchbacks, and reached the meadow at Spence Field in the late afternoon. At nearly 5,000 feet of elevation, the air was thinner and cooler here, and the trees gave way to open ground, surrounded by dense rhododendron thickets. They weren't alone. Another family, the Keys, had also stopped there for a picnic. The children, quick to become friends, decided to play hide and seek. It was about 4:30 p.m., Dennis, wearing a bright red shirt, split off from the others, darting left behind a patch of thick brush, while the other boys ran to the right. The plan was to leap out together and surprise the adults. Only 3 emerged. At first, Clyde called for his son calmly, then louder, then with growing panic. There was no reply, not a cry, not a rustle. He sprinted nearly 2 miles down the trail in both directions, shouting Dennis's name, then returned, breathless and empty-handed. Within the hour, they alerted park rangers. What happened next was one of the most extensive and confounding search efforts in national park history. Rangers arrived that evening, but by then, the weather was changing. A sudden storm rolled over the ridgeline, dumping almost 3 inches of rain. Wind gusts swept through the hollows. The temperature plummeted. Any small footprints Dennis might have left were washed away in hours. The next morning, teams fanned out from Spencefield. Radios hissed and faded in and out, their signals weakening in the steep terrain. In the 1,960 seconds, the park's communications network was still primitive. Elevation shifts, water-laden air, and temperature inversions all distorted radio waves. Signals that were clear on the ridgeline disappeared entirely once rangers stepped into the drainages below. In one search log entry, a team leader wrote, "Signal vanished. Less than 200 yards from base, could hear only static." It was an early sign of how the terrain itself would fight them. Within 3 days, more than 1,400 people joined the search. Helicopters hovered overhead. Bloodhounds followed scent trails down steep slopes, into streams, and toward the Tennessee side. One dog tracked Dennis's scent for nearly a mile before it ended abruptly at a creek, perhaps lost to rushing water or redirected by wind. Some searchers claimed to find a small Oxford-style footprint near the stream bed, followed by another that appeared bare, but the evidence was inconclusive. It could have been Dennis. It could have been one of the hundreds of volunteers now trampling the ground. The Smoky Mountains are not gentle to the lost. Steep ravines plunge into hidden gullies. Laurel Hell thick walls of rhododendron can conceal a person only a few feet away. Sudden drops, moss-covered rocks, and tangled roots make walking slow and dangerous. In places, fog gathers so quickly that visibility shrinks to just a few steps. Rangers knew that a 6-year-old, even if uninjured, could disappear from view in seconds and wander deep into places where no one could hear him shout. The search grid expanded beyond Spencefield into miles of adjacent valleys and ridges. Volunteers swept through hollows in long lines, calling Dennis's name every few steps. Helicopters scanned tree canopies with infrared cameras, but the dense foliage rendered them useless. At night, teams used whistles and fired flares, hoping Dennis might respond if he was hiding. Nothing came back. As the days passed, other reports surfaced. A family camping several miles away claimed they heard a high-pitched scream around the time Dennis vanished. One member said they saw a rough-looking man moving quickly through the woods, carrying something over his shoulder. Investigators followed up, but the location and timing didn't align precisely with known events. The lead went nowhere. Weeks turned into months. Searchers combed caves, dragged streams, and even lowered ropes into vertical shafts that might conceal remains. They found no clothing, no bones, no trace of the red shirt Dennis had been wearing. The only consistent mystery was the silence radios still malfunctioned in pockets of terrain. Dogs lost sense without warning, and sound seemed to vanish beyond certain ridgelines. Scientists later noted that temperature, moisture, and the magnetic properties of the Smokies' bedrock can all affect radio propagation. Layers of sandstone and metamorphic rock can absorb or scatter signals. Narrow valleys channel sound upward rather than outward. Even today, search and rescue teams often lose communication below 5,000 feet, especially near the North Carolina line. Some investigators believe these same conditions could have disoriented Dennis, muffling the calls of rescuers even if he were nearby. In the 1,980 seconds, a man claimed he stumbled upon skeletal remains while illegally collecting ginseng deep within the park. He told no one at the time, fearing prosecution. When he finally reported it, investigators searched the area but found nothing. Decades of rain, landslides, and shifting soil had altered the landscape beyond recognition. Dennis's disappearance changed how the National Park Service approached search and rescue operations. In 1969, coordination was chaotic. Maps were hand-drawn. Radios were unreliable. Communication between teams often failed. The Martin case became a textbook example of how quickly evidence can vanish in the Smokies and how critical technology, planning, and communication are when time is measured in minutes. More than half a century later, the meadow at Spence Field still looks much as it did that day, quiet, green, and open to the wind. Hikers pass through on their way to Rocky Top or Thunderhead Mountain, often unaware that one of the most baffling mysteries in park history began here. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the ridges and ravines hold their silence. And somewhere in that silence, a boy's last footsteps remain, erased by rain and time. The gravity that pulled too hard. In early October 2017, a trio of hikers from Asheville longtime friends Mark Ellis, Dana Rivera, and Owen Parker set out to explore a little visited stretch of the Smokies known as the Bone Hollow Basin. The basin, carved into the flank of Thunderhead Mountain, is a steep, narrow valley rarely visited by tourists. It has no formal trails, no established campsites, and almost no cell signal. What drew the three, there was a rumor they'd read about in an old mountaineering journal, that compasses spun unpredictably near the basin floor, and that hikers often felt as though the ground was pulling them downward. Most dismissed it as folklore. They wanted to see for themselves. They began their hike on October 6, descending from the Boat Mountain Trail into a network of unmarked game paths. The terrain quickly grew difficult slopes, as steep as 40 degrees, loose rock underfoot, and thick vegetation choking the hillside. By early afternoon, they reached a narrow defile between two ridges. There, according to Dana's journal, all three felt something they couldn't explain. At first it was subtle, a sense of heaviness, as if their packs had suddenly gained weight. Walking became harder. Their knees ached more with each step, but the slope was no steeper than before. Within 20 minutes, they were moving slowly and deliberately, pausing often to catch their breath. Owen joked that they must have hit a gravity pocket. Mark, a mechanical engineer, tried to rationalize it as fatigue until he noticed something stranger. Pebbles they kicked from the trail seemed to fall more quickly than expected, hitting the ground almost instantly rather than bouncing forward. Water from their bottles poured in thicker, shorter arcs. The deeper they descended, the stronger the sensation grew. Dana's watch, equipped with a barometric altimeter, recorded a pressure reading nearly 7 millibars higher than it should have been for their elevation. This implied either an equipment malfunction or a sudden, localized increase in air pressure. Both were rare, but the data matched what they felt. The air was denser, their bodies heavier, the slope harder to climb, even on level ground. By 3:40 p.m., Dana and Mark decided to turn back. Owen, however, insisted on pushing farther down into the basin. He argued that if there was a natural cause, perhaps a sinkhole or a gravitational anomaly linked to dense rock below, they could document it. The two reluctantly agreed to wait for him near a recognizable boulder field and told him not to go more than 30 minutes. He never came back. Search and rescue operations began the following morning. Teams descended into Bone Hollow and scoured the valley floor. They found Owen's trekking pole about 0.7 miles from where he separated, embedded upright in a patch of soft soil, as if it had been dropped vertically rather than thrown. Nearby lay his map, weighed down by a small stone. There were no footprints beyond that point. Dogs brought to the site tracked his scent briefly before stopping in the middle of an open clearing. "It's like he just vanished mid-step," one handler reported. Theories about what the trio experienced began forming almost immediately. Geologists suggested that the sensation of heaviness might have been due to a local gravity anomaly variations in the density of subsurface rock that slightly increase gravitational pull. While such anomalies are typically tiny and imperceptible, certain geological formations, such as pockets of high iron ore, can locally amplify gravitational force by measurable amounts. If a sufficiently dense deposit existed beneath Bone Hollow, it could, in theory, explain both the heavier sensation and the barometric anomalies. Another hypothesis centered on atmospheric pooling. Cold, heavy air can settle in basins like Bone Hollow, particularly in autumn when nighttime temperatures drop sharply. If trapped by inversion layers, this dense air can create localized pressure increases and subtle but noticeable physical effects. It also displaces oxygen, potentially leading to lightheadedness, confusion, and impaired judgment conditions that might explain why Owen continued into the basin despite clear discomfort. But these scientific explanations did not answer the more troubling questions. Why his scent trail ended abruptly, why no signs of a fall or animal encounter were ever found, and why the anomaly seemed to intensify near the exact spot he vanished. Some searchers speculated that Owen may have fallen into a hidden sinkhole or fissure concealed beneath vegetation. The Smokies are known for karst features, underground voids formed by water erosion that can swallow a person whole and leave no surface evidence. Yet ground-penetrating radar deployed in the area detected no such cavities. Others theorized that the gravitational anomaly itself might have disoriented him, causing him to veer off course into terrain that rescuers hadn't searched. But after 2 weeks and more than 60 miles of grid searches, nothing surfaced. To this day, the Bone Hollow Basin remains one of the least understood areas in the park. Few rangers go there without marking their route, and none go alone. Instruments brought into the basin still record minor but consistent irregularities, slightly higher gravity readings, subtle magnetic interference, and unusual barometric pressure fluctuations. None are dramatic enough to pose a danger, but they are enough to unsettle even experienced researchers. Hikers who visit sometimes report the same sensations the trio described: their packs suddenly heavier, their breath shorter, their legs reluctant to climb. Most turn back before reaching the clearing where Owen disappeared. And those who do press on often speak of a peculiar feeling as if the earth itself is holding them in place. What happened to Owen Parker remains unknown. Perhaps he fell into an unseen ravine. Perhaps he wandered deeper into the wilderness, disoriented and oxygen deprived. Or perhaps the force that held him down that day, subtle, invisible, but real, never released him. The static in the air. It was the 14th of September 2021 when 4 two-year-old radio technician and amateur hiker Nathan Willis decided to explore a section of the Smoky Mountains few tourists ever visit, a densely wooded basin northwest of Newfound Gap, known informally among rangers as the Still Pocket. Nathan was fascinated by natural radio anomalies, places where signals fade or distort, and he had read online accounts of hikers reporting strange static interference in this particular region. Most dismissed those stories as exaggerations. Nathan, with a background in telecommunications, wanted to test them himself. He arrived early, parking his truck at Clingmans Dome and beginning his descent along a faint game trail leading into the basin. He carried standard hiking gear along with an array of electronic devices, a handheld transceiver, a signal strength meter, a digital compass, and a weatherproof GPS beacon. He also wore a smartwatch synced to his phone, which he used to log altitude and barometric pressure changes. For the first 2 hours, everything was normal. His radio picked up standard chatter from park repeaters, and his compass readings were stable. But as he approached a low, narrow ravine just after noon, things began to change. The radio, which had been clear moments before, erupted in a burst of static. The GPS froze on a single coordinate. The compass needle spun in slow circles. Nathan recorded a voice note on his phone at 12:17 p.m. All signals are dropping. Compass is gone. It's like something is pulling power out of everything. That was his last transmission. When Nathan failed to check in that evening, his wife reported him missing. Rangers found his truck the next morning untouched. They began a search from the coordinates of his last logged position. 2 miles into the basin, they discovered something deeply unsettling. Nathan's radio, phone, and GPS unit all stacked neatly on a flat stone. His backpack rested beside them. His boots were found 10 feet away. But Nathan was gone. Investigators immediately noticed something else. Their own equipment began to fail. Radios crackled and died. GPS units froze. Even analog compasses spun aimlessly. A drone launched above the clearing lost connection and crashed within minutes. For the next several hours, all electronic devices in the immediate area malfunctioned simultaneously. Once teams moved back uphill, everything returned to normal. Scientists brought in later concluded that the most likely explanation was natural electromagnetic interference, a rare but possible phenomenon caused by a combination of high iron content in the soil, intense geomagnetic fluctuations, and atmospheric conditions. The Smoky Mountains sit atop complex geological structures, and some areas contain concentrations of magnetite and hematite that can distort magnetic fields. When solar weather is active, as it was that week, these magnetic anomalies can amplify, producing localized electromagnetic effects strong enough to disrupt radio signals and even drain small batteries. But that did not explain the full picture. Days of searching revealed no further trace of Nathan. Dogs tracked his scent for nearly 400 yards before losing it completely, as if he had stepped out of the clearing and vanished into the air. Thermal imaging revealed no heat signatures. Ground-penetrating radar found no sinkholes. The most unsettling clue came from Nathan's smartwatch, which had continued to record ambient environmental data for nearly 45 minutes after his last transmission before shutting off. The readings showed a sudden, sharp drop in ambient voltage levels at 12:24 p.m., followed by erratic fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. The data was consistent with what geophysicists call a geomagnetic microburst, a short, intense pulse of electromagnetic energy. These bursts, though poorly understood, have been known to temporarily disrupt radio communication and disorient animals. One researcher described them as magnetic weather, sudden storms in the invisible fields surrounding the Earth. Could such a microburst have disoriented Nathan, causing him to wander deeper into the forest in confusion? Or could it have caused his electronic equipment, including his smartwatch, to fail, leaving him without navigation in one of the most disorienting terrains in the park? The data suggests both are possible. Another possibility, though still speculative, involves electrostatic discharge gradients. When certain mineral-rich soils and atmospheric conditions interact, they can build and release static charges at ground level. These discharges are invisible, but capable of interfering with the human nervous system, producing dizziness, disorientation, or even short-term memory loss. While there is no proof this occurred, the symptoms described by hikers in the same area, confusion, nausea, strange tingling sensations, match known effects of mild electrostatic exposure. Rangers eventually recovered all of Nathan's equipment, except for one item: his smartwatch which disappeared along with him. Its last recorded step count ended at 12:28 p.m., roughly 3 minutes after the final magnetic anomaly. No further movement was recorded. The area now known as the Still Pocket remains one of the most technologically unpredictable places in the Smokies. Rangers rarely enter it with electronic devices, preferring to use analog maps and whistle signals instead. Some even leave their radios behind entirely. Despite multiple surveys, no one has been able to replicate the electromagnetic conditions that day, and no trace of Nathan has ever surfaced. Today, the clearing where his equipment was found is overgrown and quiet. Hikers who pass through sometimes report a faint crackling in the air, like static building on a winter sweater. Others say their phones shut off for no reason, or their compasses tremble slightly before settling again. None of them stay long. Somewhere beyond that clearing, beyond the reach of signal and satellite, Nathan Willis walked into a silence that no device could penetrate, a silence charged not with emptiness, but with the unseen electricity of a landscape that can erase both technology and those who carry it. The silence at Clingmans Dome. On the morning of the 8th of October 1976, a thin mist clung to the ridges of the Great Smoky Mountains, and the high-altitude air carried the damp chill of early autumn. The trees were just beginning to turn, their leaves a mixture of green, orange, and faded gold. And a group of students from Bearden High School in Knoxville had come to the park for what should have been a simple school outing. A short hike from the Clingmans Dome observation tower down to Andrews Bald, and then back to the bus before afternoon light faded. It was a routine trip, familiar to teachers and rangers alike, and nothing about it suggested that one student would step into the forest and never return. Among the hikers that day was 16-year-old Trenny Lynn Gibson, a quiet, curious girl known for being observant and thoughtful. She had never been lost before, never wandered far from a group, and there was no reason to think this day would be different. The trail they planned to follow was well marked and frequently travelled, winding gently down through a spruce fir forest before looping back to the parking area. Teachers reminded everyone to stay together, follow the path, and meet the bus at 3:30 p.m. At first, the students walked in clusters, chatting as they went. Trenny walked with a classmate named Robert Simpson, but as the group spread out, she began moving at her own pace. Some slowed to take photos or rest, while others surged ahead. By early afternoon, they reached Andrews Bald, a grassy outcrop with sweeping views of the Smokies. After a brief break, most of the group began the return trek to the trailhead. Trenny was among those heading back, moving faster than many, stepping past classmates as she went. Several students recalled seeing her just ahead of them. One remembered her pausing briefly near the side of the trail, bending as if to look at something in the underbrush. Another said she appeared focused, walking steadily toward the front of the group, and then, within minutes, she was gone. At first, no one worried. The trail's bends and switchbacks often caused hikers to lose sight of each other, only to reunite further along. But as classmates reached the parking area, Trenny was still missing. Teachers retraced parts of the trail, calling her name into the woods. By dusk, when there was still no sign of her, park rangers were called, and a search began. Tracking dogs were brought in that evening. They followed a scent along the trail, past the Clingmans Dome observation tower, and about 1.5 miles toward Newfound Gap Road. And then, without warning, the scent stopped. It didn't weaken gradually, as though she had wandered farther away. It ended abruptly, as if she had stepped out of the forest and vanished. Rangers searched the roadside and surrounding forest, but found no footprints, no clothing, and no belongings. The landscape around Clingmans Dome is unforgiving. At over 6,600 feet, the air is thinner, the weather changes quickly, and the ground can be treacherous. Thick rhododendron thickets, known locally as Laurel Hell, can hide a person only a few steps from the trail. The slopes are steep, cut by ravines, and sudden drops, and water channels carve deep, narrow gullies. Fog can roll in within minutes, reducing visibility to a few feet and muffling sound so completely that even shouts vanish into the mist. It is easy to see how someone could step off the trail and become invisible in seconds. For days, hundreds of searchers combed the area. They dragged creeks, checked caves, and swept ridgelines with flashlights at night. Helicopters circled overhead. National Guard units joined the effort. Still, no trace appeared. Rain and dropping temperatures made conditions worse. Mud and runoff erased footprints. Dense foliage blocked aerial views. The terrain's complexity, steep slopes, loose rock, and near impenetrable vegetation slowed the search to a crawl. Investigators considered several explanations. Trenny could have left the trail accidentally, following a faint animal path or dry stream bed that she believed would lead her back. A misstep on wet rock might have sent her sliding into a ravine where heavy brush concealed her from rescuers. Others believed that she may have reached the roadside where her scent ended and encountered someone voluntarily or otherwise who took her from the park. Witness accounts added little clarity. Some classmates recalled hearing a faint rustling or the sound of water nearby. Others insisted the forest was silent. One student said Trenny had borrowed a plaid jacket earlier in the day, but no such jacket was ever recovered. Inconsistent memories, shifting details, and the absence of physical evidence left investigators with only speculation. Over the years, searchers returned to the area with more advanced tools. They brought drones, thermal imaging, and ground-penetrating radar. They explored deep gullies, sinkholes, and hollow tree trunks. They scanned slopes that had been too dangerous to search in 1976. They found nothing, no bones, no clothing, no sign that anyone had ever been there. The abrupt end of the scent trail remains the most perplexing detail of the case. Scent typically weakens slowly over distance, but in this case it stopped completely. Some experts believe that wind shifts, rain, or water crossings could explain the break. Others argue that it points to human involvement, that Trenny may have left the area in a vehicle. Both theories remain unproven. The official search was scaled back after several weeks, but the case never closed. It is still listed in National Park Service records as an open missing persons investigation. Decades later, the same questions linger. How could a 16-year-old girl vanish so completely on a clear afternoon, on a trail filled with dozens of classmates? Why did her scent end near a roadside? And how did she leave no trace at all? Hikers still walk the same trail today, following the same bends and switchbacks, pausing at the same overlooks where the class stood that day. Most pass the area without realizing that someone once vanished here. But for those who know the story, the forest feels different. They stop where the scent trail ended, where the forest edge meets the road, and they imagine a girl stepping into the mist, leaving behind no footprints, no sounds, no answers. Almost 50 years later, the Smokies still hold their silence. The forest remains as it was, deep, dark, and full of places where the ground swallows evidence, and the wind carries away the sound of a name called into the trees. And somewhere in that silence, the story of Trenny Lynn Gibson, her final steps, her unknown fate remains hidden, woven into the landscape that refused to give her back. The air that was too thin. In late May of 2013, a group of 5 hikers from Chapel Hill set out to summit Clingmans Dome, the highest point in the Great Smoky Mountains, on what they expected to be a straightforward 2-day trip. They were all in good health, seasoned weekend backpackers with dozens of miles behind them. The weather was clear, the trail dry, and visibility stretched nearly 70 miles from the observation tower. By all accounts, there was nothing unusual about the hike. Yet before the sun set on their second day, one of them, 9-year-old mechanical engineer Aaron Cole, would walk silently into the trees and disappear. The group began their ascent from the Forney Ridge trailhead early on May 26. The climb to the summit is steep but manageable, rising to over 6,600 feet. While far below the altitudes that typically cause altitude sickness, Clingmans Dome sits atop a ridge where atmospheric conditions are subtly but measurably different. The thinner air, roughly 20% less oxygen than at sea level, combines with sudden temperature swings, shifting pressure layers, and volatile weather systems that move unpredictably across the Smokies. Most hikers feel nothing more than slight fatigue, but sometimes, under the right conditions, those small changes create a perfect storm. By mid-afternoon, the group reached the summit without incident. They rested, ate lunch, and planned to descend along the Appalachian Trail before camping near Mount Collins. But as they prepared to leave, Aaron mentioned feeling light-headed and off balance. He laughed it off, assuming he hadn't eaten enough. Within 30 minutes, though, 2 others reported similar symptoms: mild headaches, ringing in their ears, and what one described as a strange pressure behind the eyes. At first, they blamed dehydration, but water and rest did little to help. As they descended, the sensations grew more pronounced. One hiker later described the feeling as like walking through thinner air than my body expected. Another reported subtle visual distortions. The trees seemed closer together than they were, and the ground appeared to shift slightly underfoot. By 4 p.m., Aaron stopped speaking altogether, walking in silence at the back of the group. When they paused to check on him, he stared past them with an unfocused gaze, then turned and stepped off the trail without a word. The others shouted for him to stop, but he continued calmly into the undergrowth and vanished from view. They followed for nearly a mile, calling his name and marking their route, but found no trace. At 6:15 p.m., they radioed for help. Search and rescue teams were on site by dawn. They located Aaron's footprints, heading north into a dense patch of spruce fir forest, a difficult environment known for poor visibility and soft, mossy ground that erases evidence quickly. But just 300 yards from the trail, the footprints ended abruptly. There were no broken branches, no torn fabric, no signs of a fall. It was as if he had dissolved into the landscape. The group's symptoms drew the attention of investigators and park scientists. Atmospheric data from sensors on Clingmans Dome recorded unusually low oxygen levels that afternoon, approximately 18.7%, compared to the normal 20.9%. This drop, though seemingly minor, was enough to induce transient hypoxia, a condition where the brain receives slightly less oxygen than it needs. Symptoms include confusion, tunnel vision, hallucinations, and impaired decision-making, all consistent with the hikers' accounts. But the cause of the oxygen drop was stranger still. Meteorologists determined that a strong inversion layer had formed that day, trapping a pocket of stagnant, low-density air along the summit ridge. Combined with rising humidity and falling barometric pressure, the effect concentrated the thin air in a narrow band, creating what one scientist described as a micro-altitude zone, an environment closer in composition to air at 9,000 feet than 6,600. Such events are rare but not unprecedented in the Smokies, where complex topography and shifting winds can trap atmospheric layers in ways not seen in flatter regions. This phenomenon likely explains the hikers' shared disorientation, but not Aaron's disappearance. Search teams mapped every ravine, drainage, and possible route within a 5-mile radius. They deployed thermal imaging, cadaver dogs, and helicopters. After 14 days, no trace was found. The theory that he became lost and succumbed to the elements was considered, but without remains, it was impossible to confirm. More speculative explanations emerged. Some neurologists suggested Aaron may have experienced hypoxic fugue, a rare condition in which oxygen deprivation triggers dissociative behavior, essentially a state of automatic wandering without memory or intention. Victims can travel miles without realizing it, often in straight lines, sometimes toward perceived open spaces that do not exist. It might explain why Aaron seemed calm, almost purposeful, as he left the trail. Others pointed to a phenomenon documented in a handful of other Smoky Mountain disappearances: perceptual narrowing. Under certain physiological stresses, oxygen deprivation, dehydration, extreme fatigue, the brain's ability to process spatial information collapses. Trails appear to shift, sounds become distant, and the line between safe and unsafe space blurs. A person in this state can step off a ridge believing they're still on level ground. If Aaron did so, his body could have fallen into a steep ravine, hidden by vegetation, a scenario consistent with the terrain, though no physical evidence supports it. For the hikers who were with him, the memory remains haunting. He wasn't panicking, one recalled. He wasn't lost. He just walked away like he was following something we couldn't see. Today, Clingmans Dome attracts thousands of visitors every year. Most notice nothing unusual. But rangers still warn hikers about rapid weather shifts and the subtle effects of thinner air, even at elevations that seem safe. The oxygen levels here are never dangerously low, but the combination of altitude, inversion layers, and human physiology can create conditions where the mind drifts before the body realizes something is wrong. And somewhere beyond the spruce and fir, beyond the trail where footprints fade into moss and silence, Aaron Cole's final steps are lost, carried into the thin air of a mountain that can change not only what you see, but what you believe is real. The trail that bent back on itself. The morning of the 27th of May 1981 began with clear skies over the Great Smoky Mountains, the kind of spring day that draws hikers into the backcountry. The air was cool but calm, the trails firm after a week without rain, and visibility from the higher ridges stretched for miles. On that morning, two friends from Nashville, Mark Reynolds and David Parker, set out from the Alum Cave trailhead just after sunrise, intending to complete a simple but scenic hike to Mount LeConte. They had hiked the route once before. The plan was to follow the well-marked path up through the hardwood forest, past the bluffs and switchbacks, reach the summit before noon, rest for lunch, and return to their car by early evening. Both men were experienced hikers. Mark, 34, worked as a surveyor and often spent weekends in the mountains. David, 31, had completed multiple multi-day hikes in the Smokies and carried a detailed topographic map of the area. They wore proper gear, carried compasses, and told their families they expected to be home by nightfall. There was nothing unusual about the plan, nothing to suggest that by day's end, one of them would vanish without a trace. The first part of the hike was uneventful. They moved steadily along the trail, stopping occasionally to drink water and photograph the views from Inspiration Point. They reached Alum Cave bluffs around mid-morning, rested briefly in the shade, and then continued upward. Sometime after 10 a.m., they noticed something odd. Though they had been walking for nearly 2 hours, the terrain ahead looked strangely familiar, a cluster of boulders they swore they had passed earlier, a fallen pine that seemed identical to one they'd stepped over before. Assuming it was coincidence, they pressed on. By noon, the strangeness had deepened. They should have been approaching the LeConte Lodge area, but instead, the trail dipped into a grove of hemlocks and looped back toward a clearing they recognized from earlier. At first they laughed it off, joking that they must have taken a wrong turn, but as they consulted the map and compass, they realized they had not left the main trail at all. Somehow, despite walking continuously in what they believed was a single direction, they had returned almost exactly to where they had started 4 hours earlier. This phenomenon, known among search and rescue teams as circular drift, is not unheard of in dense mountain terrain. Disorientation, subtle shifts in slope, and human instinct can lead hikers to unknowingly walk in wide loops. But this was different. Both men insisted they had followed the same marked trail the entire time. There had been no junctions, no side paths, and no sign that they had reversed course. Mark suggested they try again, this time carefully tracking the sun's position and using the compass to verify direction. They set out once more at 12:45 p.m. For several hours, they moved deliberately uphill, checking their bearings every few minutes. Yet, by 3 p.m., the forest around them felt familiar again. A broken tree trunk shaped like a crooked Y. A patch of moss they remembered, stepping over, and then, impossibly, they emerged once more into the same clearing. The second loop was more unsettling than the first. Mark grew uneasy and suggested turning back toward the trailhead before nightfall. David, however, wanted to make one final attempt. He proposed they split up briefly. He would continue uphill while Mark remained behind to ensure they were not unintentionally circling together. They agreed to rendezvous at the clearing by 4:30 p.m. Mark waited. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. There was no sign of David. At 5 p.m, he shouted his friend's name into the woods. No answer. He climbed a small rise to get a better view and scanned the slopes for movement. Nothing. As the light began to fade, he followed the trail downhill alone, reaching the parking lot just after sunset. Rangers were notified that evening. Search teams began their work before dawn. They swept the area between Alum Cave and the summit, calling David's name and leaving markers to prevent overlap. Bloodhounds were deployed, but their scent trails looped erratically before fading altogether. Helicopters scanned the forest from above, while ground crews searched ravines and stream beds. No footprints, clothing, or signs of a fall were ever found. The most perplexing detail came from the tracking teams. Despite extensive effort, they could not confirm David had ever left the main trail. There was no evidence he had wandered far, yet no evidence he had remained nearby either. It was as if he had stepped into the forest and been erased from it entirely. Over the following weeks, theories circulated among rangers and investigators. One explanation focused on environmental disorientation. The Smokies are full of subtle geographic illusions, repeating patterns of trees and rock formations that can trick even experienced hikers. Fog and filtered sunlight can distort distance and depth, while sloping terrain can alter a person's internal sense of direction. Under certain conditions, magnetic minerals in the bedrock can even interfere with compass accuracy, though tests conducted later showed no significant anomalies near Alum Cave. Another theory suggested that David may have attempted a shortcut or off-trail descent, believing it would lead back to the main route, only to become trapped in a steep ravine or hidden crevice. Searchers checked dozens of such sites, including several narrow fissures and sinkholes, but found nothing. The most unsettling possibility, though rarely discussed publicly, was that David encountered someone else, a poacher, a backcountry camper, or another hiker, and was taken from the area. But there were no reports of strangers nearby, no unusual vehicles, and no signs of a struggle. The official search lasted 19 days before being scaled back. Mark was questioned extensively, but never considered a suspect. Investigators concluded that David likely became disoriented and perished in the wilderness, though why his body was never recovered remains unanswered. The site where the two men found themselves looping back has since gained a quiet reputation among rangers and seasoned hikers. Many avoid the area alone, describing it as strangely disorienting. Compasses sometimes spin briefly without cause, and GPS devices can lose signal for short periods. Whether these are natural phenomena or coincidences is unknown. Today, decades later, the trail remains unchanged. Thousands of hikers pass through Alum Cave each year without incident. Yet the story of the hike that folded in on itself of two friends walking forward only to end up where they began, and of one who vanished while trying to break free of the circle lingers as one of the Smokies' strangest disappearances. Somewhere beyond that familiar clearing, in the folds of the ridges and shadows of the forest, David Parker's fate remains hidden, the path he took lost to time and memory. The Valley That Warped Time. It was late August 2004 when 3 8-year-old biology teacher and avid solo hiker Michael Harrington set out for a 2-day trek into the Smokies. His route was ambitious but not unusual. Start at the Kephart Shelter, follow the Sweat Heifer Creek Trail deep into the backcountry, and spend a night camping in a remote basin near the confluence of 2 unnamed streams. The valley was rarely visited, known mostly to experienced hikers and old park rangers who referred to it half-jokingly as the Clock Pocket. It was an inside joke born from a handful of odd stories over the decades: watches that stopped working, compasses that spun wildly, and the unnerving feeling that the day was shorter than it should have been. Michael left a note on his kitchen table for his sister saying he'd be home by Sunday night. He was last seen by 2 hikers near Charlie's Bunyan on the afternoon of August 21, moving steadily uphill with his usual heavy pack and a small GPS unit clipped to his belt. When he didn't return by Tuesday morning, his family reported him missing. Search teams mobilized within hours. On the 3rd day, they found him. Michael was seated calmly on a log at the edge of a clearing, just over 2 miles from his intended campsite. He was dehydrated but otherwise unharmed, with no visible injuries. When asked how long he'd been lost, he looked confused. "I'm not lost," he replied. "I just stopped for a break. It's still Saturday afternoon." It was Wednesday morning. He had been missing for nearly 84 hours. The strange details multiplied quickly. Michael's digital watch, known for its accuracy, displayed a date and time that placed him less than 3 hours past his planned arrival at camp. His GPS unit contained no data beyond that Saturday afternoon, as if the device had not been turned on since then. Even stranger, his camera contained several photographs taken on what should have been Sunday morning: sunrise over the valley, dew on his tent, and a stream flowing beneath mossy stones. Yet according to park weather records, it rained heavily on Sunday morning. The photos showed clear skies. Michael's recollections of the missing days were fragmented and inconsistent. He remembered setting up camp and falling asleep Saturday night. He remembered waking up to morning light, eating breakfast, and beginning to hike eastward. At some point, he said, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The birdsong stopped. The wind died. He felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. Then, the next thing he remembered was sitting on the log, certain only a few hours had passed. Theories about what happened to Michael range from physiological to physical, and none of them fully satisfy. Doctors found no evidence of trauma, stroke, or seizure. Toxicology tests were negative. He had no signs of dehydration-induced hallucination or hypothermia-related confusion. If he had wandered aimlessly for 4 days, he should have shown more severe physical deterioration. Scientists who studied the case were particularly intrigued by the time discrepancies in his equipment. Michael's watch and GPS were both quartz-based devices, which rely on highly stable oscillating crystals to measure time. For them to lose 3 days' worth of time simultaneously would require either severe physical shock or exposure to a strong electromagnetic field, yet there were no signs of either. The same anomaly appeared in his camera metadata, which suggested its internal clock had paused for roughly 70 hours. Geophysicists consulted by the park proposed one possible explanation: temporal distortion caused by electromagnetic phase shifts, rare events where fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field can interfere with quartz oscillations, slowing or pausing them without visible damage. This phenomenon has been documented in laboratory conditions, but never conclusively observed in the wild. Still, The Smokies are known for strong magnetic anomalies due to iron-rich geology, and under rare conditions such as a solar storm or geomagnetic pulse, it's possible that local instruments could have been affected simultaneously. Another theory focused on gravitational time dilation, a concept from Einstein's theory of relativity. Technically, time passes slightly slower in stronger gravitational fields, though the difference is minuscule, measurable only near massive objects like planets or stars. However, geologists noted that the valley where Michael was found sits atop an unusually dense rock formation with significant gravitational anomalies. Could such an anomaly combined with unknown local conditions have produced measurable effects on timekeeping devices? Most physicists say no, but the theory lingers. More speculative still are the eyewitness reports from the area. In the years since Michael's disappearance, at least a dozen hikers have reported losing track of time in the same valley. Watches fall behind. Phones restart unexpectedly. One group swore they hiked for 2 hours only to find the sun had barely moved. Another reported a sudden transition from late afternoon light to near darkness in a matter of minutes. Rangers attribute most of these accounts to human error, but the consistency of the stories is difficult to ignore. Even Michael, years later, insists his memory is not faulty. "I know what I saw. I know what I felt," he told a journalist in 2011. "It was like time stopped paying attention to me, like it slipped sideways." Today, the valley remains unmarked on most trail maps. Rangers discourage hikers from camping there and advise them to check their equipment regularly if they pass through. The clock pocket, as old rangers still call it, is quiet, unnervingly so. The wind moves differently there. Sound seems to arrive a second too late. And for reasons no one can yet explain, watches tick a little slower when you step into that hollow. Somewhere in that still basin beneath layers of dense rock and shifting fields, something bends more than just the trail. And whether the answer lies in magnetic fields, gravitational quirks, or something stranger still, the Smoky Mountains seem to hold not just people, but time itself. The rain that fell upward. It began as a straightforward search and rescue operation, the kind rangers in the Great Smoky Mountains conduct dozens of times each year. In early June 2018, a 6-year-old graduate student named Emily Rhodes vanished while conducting soil sampling research near the remote upper slopes of Mingus Creek. She had set out alone on June 3rd with a field notebook, a moisture meter, and a lightweight pack. When she failed to return that evening, her advisor reported her missing. Within 24 hours, a 6-person search team from the park's backcountry unit was deployed. What they encountered over the next 48 hours would enter Smoky Mountain lore, not because they failed to find Emily, but because of what nature itself appeared to do in the place she vanished. The team arrived at the search zone on June 4th under overcast skies. Standard procedures applied: GPS mapping grids, drone reconnaissance, and search dogs working in paired sweeps. The first hours yielded little, a few scattered soil sample bags, a dropped water bottle, and faint boot impressions leading into a steep ravine. Then, around 2:50 p.m., weather instruments detected a sudden and dramatic inversion. Atmospheric pressure at ground level rose sharply, humidity levels surged, and an unusual vertical airflow appeared in the data. Minutes later, the searchers saw something they would later struggle to describe: raindrops fine and mist, like lifting gently from the forest floor and spiraling upward into the canopy. At first, they assumed they were witnessing evaporation, but this was different. The droplets were too large, too cohesive, and they moved in steady columns rather than dispersing. One ranger described them as like tiny glass beads floating back into the sky. Another recalled watching a leaf coated with moisture empty itself into the air as if gravity had briefly changed direction. The event lasted roughly 8 minutes. It was more than a curiosity. Within minutes of the anomaly, their radios began to fail. Compasses drifted as much as 15 degrees. A handheld barometer showed pressure fluctuations too rapid to be natural. 2 team members reported ringing in their ears, followed by lightheadedness and disorientation. One Ranger veteran rescuer, David Sloan, collapsed briefly and later described an intense sensation that up and down had switched places. Data retrieved from the search team's instruments later revealed what meteorologists called a microinversion column, a rare, localized atmospheric event in which a sudden surge of warm air rising from the ground meets a descending pocket of cooler, heavier air. In extremely rare circumstances, this interaction can create temporary reversed convection, essentially a vertical channel where moisture and light particles are pulled upward rather than down. Such phenomena have been recorded during volcanic eruptions or intense desert storms, but almost never in a temperate forest. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. At 3:04 p.m., just as the anomaly peaked, the team realized one of their members, 1-year-old search technician Luis Navarro, was gone. He had been walking in the rear of the group, marking trees with flagging tape. The ranger ahead of him glanced back less than 2 minutes earlier. When they called his name, there was no answer. His pack, marked tape roll, and radio lay on the ground where he had been standing. His footprints ended abruptly in a patch of soft soil, undisturbed beyond that point. An immediate search was launched. Teams fanned out in a 360-degree radius. Thermal imaging drones scanned the canopy, suspecting Luis might have climbed or fallen into a tree during the confusion. Ground teams swept every drainage and ravine within a mile. Nothing. The dogs brought in the next morning followed his scent to the same spot and stopped. Scientists later examined the anomaly's potential role. One theory proposed that the rapid inversion had created a transient low-pressure vortex, a vertical funnel of rising air, strong enough to lift small debris or disorient a person enough to make them step unknowingly into hazardous terrain. Another, more speculative, theory suggested that static charge differentials during the event might have interfered with the human vestibular system, disrupting balance and spatial awareness. This could explain why Luis's footprints ended so suddenly. He might have stumbled, crawled, or walked in a direction he didn't perceive as down. Whatever happened, the search continued for 19 days. Teams logged over 400 man-hours, covering 50 square miles. Helicopters scanned riverbanks, cave mouths, and ravines. Not a trace was found, not clothing, not equipment, not a single item of gear beyond what he had dropped. Emily Rhodes, the original missing researcher, was also never located. Today, the ravine is still rarely visited. Rangers warn backcountry hikers about sudden inversion events and advise them to carry analog instruments, traditional compasses, and aneroid barometers in case electronics fail. They also caution that disorientation here is not merely psychological. The valley's unusual terrain, combined with sudden shifts in air density, can create sensory confusion powerful enough to warp the body's basic sense of direction. Hikers who pass through occasionally report unsettling sensations, rain that seems to pause mid-air, branches swaying upward rather than down, a stomach-dropping feeling that gravity has shifted slightly to the side. One searcher who returned to the site years later described it succinctly: "It's like the forest is breathing, and sometimes it exhales." Neither Emily Rhodes nor Luis Navarro has ever been found. Their names remain etched in the park's incident logs, alongside a brief, almost clinical note on page 12 of the final report. At approximately 1,500 hours, moisture movement observed in upward vertical trajectory concurrent with personnel disappearance. It is the closest any official document comes to admitting what the rescuers already knew, that for a few minutes in June 2018, gravity itself appeared to reverse, and two people stepped into a mystery that rose into the sky. The Vanishing Path by Deep Creek. The afternoon of the 25th of September 1981 was mild and bright over the Great Smoky Mountains. It was the kind of day that draws visitors from nearby towns into the park's quieter corners, the ones without heavy crowds or paved overlooks. For Pauline "Polly" Melton, a 58-year-old woman from Jacksonville, Florida, the plan was simple. She and two close friends, both in their 60s, would spend the afternoon walking the familiar Deep Creek Trail near Bryson City, North Carolina. It was a route they knew well, a gentle incline through mixed hardwood forest, following the sound of water downstream, past rhododendron thickets and shaded bends. It was a path Polly had walked many times before. Polly had been visiting the Smokies every summer with her husband, Bob, staying in a small trailer near the campground. They were regulars, part of a loose community of seasonal visitors who spent their days fishing, hiking, or sitting around evening fires. She was in good health, cheerful, and sociable, and had shown no signs of distress before the hike. That morning, she had eaten breakfast with her husband and friends, laughing and talking as usual. Nothing suggested that the day ahead would be anything but ordinary. The three women started down the Deep Creek Trail just after 2 p.m. The path wound gently beneath a canopy of oaks and maples, their leaves beginning to turn. They kept a leisurely pace, pausing to watch the creek's current sweep past boulders and listening to the hum of late-season insects. About a mile into the hike, Polly's pace changed. Without warning, she quickened her stride and pulled ahead. One friend called out for her to slow down. She turned briefly, waved, and continued on. It was the last time they saw her. At first, they assumed she was simply walking ahead to the next bend in the trail. But when they rounded that bend, Polly was gone. They hurried forward, calling her name. The trail was straightforward, with no confusing junctions or forks. There was nowhere obvious for her to have turned. Yet she had vanished into the woods as completely as if she had stepped through a door. When Polly did not return to the campground that evening, her husband contacted rangers. By nightfall, search crews were combing the trail by flashlight. They walked in grid patterns, called her name into the darkness, and scanned the banks of the creek for any sign of movement. Nothing appeared. Over the next 2 weeks, the search widened. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras swept the forest canopy. Teams on foot checked drainage channels, rock overhangs, and animal dens. Volunteers searched every trail and side path within 5 miles. They used whistles and bullhorns, left food and water caches in case she was injured but alive, and dragged sections of the creek. Dogs were deployed, but scent trails were faint and inconsistent, dissipating entirely near a small bend in the trail, the last place anyone had seen her. Investigators struggled to explain how a person could disappear so quickly and silently. One theory suggested a medical emergency, a sudden collapse just out of sight, but no body was ever found. Another considered the possibility of an intentional disappearance. Polly had reportedly reconnected with a male friend from Florida earlier that year and written to him before the trip. Perhaps, some speculated, she had arranged to meet him and start a new life. But that theory did not hold up under scrutiny. Polly's purse, identification, money, and car were all left behind. She was not known to be unhappy in her marriage, and there were no records of her boarding a bus, entering a vehicle, or using her finances after that day. The possibility of foul play was also raised. Could someone have intercepted her on the trail? But the Deep Creek area was relatively busy that afternoon, and no hikers reported seeing anyone suspicious. There were no signs of a struggle, no disturbed vegetation, and no physical evidence left behind. Environmental factors offered their own complications. The terrain around Deep Creek can be deceptive. The trail slopes gently, but the surrounding land is cut by steep embankments, hidden drop-offs, and narrow ravines that vanish beneath thick undergrowth. Rhododendron thickets, sometimes called laurel hell, form near impenetrable walls, easily hiding a person just a few feet from the trail. Heavy rainfall in the days that followed could have washed away footprints or scent trails, and the creek itself, calm on the surface, contains deep undercurrents in certain bends, capable of sweeping objects downstream and burying them beneath silt and debris. Despite these factors, the complete lack of evidence continued to puzzle investigators. A person leaving the trail typically leaves some sign: a torn piece of fabric, a broken branch, a footprint. But Polly's disappearance offered none. It was as though she had stepped forward and been erased. Decades later, the case remains unsolved. The last confirmed location, a small bend in the trail near a stretch of rhododendron that slopes toward the water, is still marked in ranger files. Her name remains on the National Park Service's cold case list. Occasionally, hikers claim to have seen something: a woman matching her description walking along a distant ridge, or a faint voice calling above the sound of the creek, but no credible evidence has ever surfaced. The landscape itself has changed little. The trail still curves gently through the forest. The water still runs over the same stones, and the light still filters through the same canopy. Most hikers who pass through today have no idea that a woman once vanished on this path in the space of a few minutes. They walk where she walked, cross the same small wooden bridges, and stand beside the same bend in the creek, unaware that beyond that point, the trail once crossed an invisible boundary between the known and the unknown. The story of Polly Melton is now woven into the deeper lore of the Smokies, a reminder that even the most ordinary afternoon can slip beyond explanation. A single step ahead, a slight change in pace, and a familiar path can become something else entirely. Somewhere beyond that bend, among the trees and the sound of rushing water, her final moments remain sealed away by the forest that never gave them back. The coordinates that didn't exist. In late March 2008, search and rescue operations in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park were no longer just a matter of following footprints and calling names into the trees. Technology, GPS beacons, satellite phones, and locator devices had become standard tools. They were supposed to eliminate many of the uncertainties that plagued earlier searches, cutting through the confusion that dense forests, sudden fog, and shifting weather often created. Yet in one case, that very technology would deepen the mystery instead of solving it, leading rescuers to a place that should have existed, but didn't. On the 22nd of March 2008, four-year-old software technician Daniel Cross arrived from Charlotte, North Carolina, for a weekend solo hike in the Smokies. He was an experienced outdoorsman, someone who logged most of his vacations on trails across the southeast. His plan this time was ambitious but straightforward. Start at the Clingmans Dome trailhead, follow the Appalachian Trail to Siler's Bald, and return via a loop that would bring him back to his car by Sunday evening. He carried a GPS-enabled satellite beacon, a device that could transmit his location at intervals and send an emergency signal if needed, and he had texted his wife coordinates for his planned route before leaving. Daniel was last seen on the morning of March 23 by a pair of hikers near Double Spring Gap Shelter. They described him as relaxed and in good spirits, pausing briefly to ask about trail conditions ahead before continuing north. When he failed to return home as scheduled that evening, his wife reported him missing. Within 24 hours, rangers launched a search. The initial data from his satellite beacon appeared promising. At 3:42 p.m. on March 23, it transmitted a location roughly 2 miles southwest of Clingmans Dome, placing him near a narrow ridge above Forney Creek. A second ping followed 20 minutes later, slightly farther west. Then, a third, at 4:25 p.m. showed him another half-mile deeper into the forest, and then nothing. The beacon stopped transmitting entirely. Search teams began at the last known coordinates and fanned outward. They expected to find signs of passage footprints, a discarded wrapper, a bent branch, but the forest floor offered nothing. They ran the GPS data through multiple systems to verify accuracy, and every readout returned the same result. The coordinates were consistent, pinpointed within a radius of less than 20 meters. Yet when teams reached the final set of coordinates on foot, they found something unexpected. The location did not match any known trail, path, or even natural feature. The spot was described in field notes as a shallow hollow surrounded by laurel, approximately 80 yards from a steep drop. No trail led to it. No sign of a campsite or firing existed. It was not listed on any topographical survey or ranger map, despite the park's records being among the most detailed in the country. And perhaps most unsettling of all, there was no trace of Daniel, no footprints entering or leaving the area. No broken branches, no evidence he had ever been there. Searchers widened their grid. Helicopters scanned the ridges with thermal cameras. Ground teams traced possible exit routes down toward Forney Creek and back toward the Appalachian Trail. The tracking dogs, deployed near the coordinates, walked in erratic patterns before losing the scent entirely. Every trail they followed ended abruptly, as if cut off. By the third day, investigators began questioning the data itself. Could the device have malfunctioned? Engineers from the manufacturer examined the signal records and confirmed they were valid. The beacon had transmitted normally, and consistently. There was no sign of damage or interference. What puzzled them was that the coordinates themselves did not align with expected terrain. The final ping was registered at an elevation 30 feet lower than any ground surface in that section of the forest. It was, on paper, as if the device had reported a location beneath the ground. Theories quickly multiplied. Some suggested that Daniel may have fallen into a sinkhole or crevice hidden beneath undergrowth. Geological surveys show that small subsurface cavities do exist in the Smokies, though most are too shallow to explain a total disappearance. Others speculated that he could have slipped into the steep drainage that drops into Forney Creek and been carried downstream. Yet repeated sweeps of the creek, including drag operations and divers, found no trace. There were also technical explanations. Temperature inversions, dense canopy, and reflected satellite signals can sometimes cause minor errors in GPS data, a few meters at most. But none of those factors could explain the 30-foot elevation discrepancy or why 3 consecutive signals clustered around a location that appeared not to exist. One curious detail deepened the mystery further. When investigators plotted the 3 beacon pings on a digital map, they formed a nearly perfect triangle with the final signal at its center. Experts noted that such a pattern could occur if the user was walking in circles or pacing a small area before stopping. But the lack of any physical evidence on the ground, not even the faint imprint of boots on soft soil, made that conclusion difficult to accept. After 19 days, the official search was suspended. Unofficial efforts continued for months. Experienced backcountry hikers volunteered to sweep unexplored ravines. Amateur satellite analysts reviewed archived imagery, hoping to spot a clue. None emerged. Today, the case of Daniel Cross remains one of the strangest in Smoky Mountain history. A disappearance mapped by technology but unsolved by evidence. The coordinates where he was last located still appear on park search maps, marked with a simple circle and a question mark. Rangers who have returned to the site describe an unremarkable patch of ground, indistinguishable from the thousands of other hollows scattered across the Smokies. And yet, it was there, according to every available source of data, that Daniel Cross's trail ended. For hikers familiar with the story, the site has taken on an almost legendary status. Some say GPS devices occasionally glitch near that section of forest, freezing briefly before recalibrating. Others report strange compass readings, with needles that swing unexpectedly before settling again. None of these anomalies are consistent or verifiable, but they add weight to the unease that surrounds the story. The coordinates remain fixed. They still lead rescuers to the same patch of laurel-covered ground, to the same quiet hollow that appears on no map. It is a place where a trail and a man vanished without explanation, where technology brought searchers closer than ever before, only to leave them facing the same enduring silence. The ridge where the compass failed. In October 1997, Great Smoky Mountains National Park Ranger Andrew McAllister set out on what should have been a routine follow-up. He had been assigned to revisit a section of the Welch Ridge Trail, a remote, seldom visited spine of land stretching above Hazel Creek, to assess conditions after a recent storm. The ridge was rugged and steep, cutting across high ground with few access points. But that was nothing unusual for McAllister, who had spent over a decade working backcountry patrol. What was unusual, however, was the history of the ridge itself. Over the previous 12 years, 3 people had vanished in the same general area, and none had ever been found. The first was 7-year-old backpacker Lisa Warren in 1985. An experienced solo hiker from Kentucky, she had left a note for her family detailing a 5-day loop through the Smokies. Her last known position was on Welch Ridge, near Cold Spring Gap. When she failed to return home, searchers found her campsite undisturbed, tent, food, gear all in place, but no trace of her anywhere nearby. The second disappearance occurred in 1991, when 2 brothers, Paul and Greg Morton, went missing while hiking a connecting trail from Hazel Creek. Their gear was found abandoned at a junction less than a quarter mile from where Lisa had last been seen. Despite one of the largest search operations in park history, neither man was located. McAllister had studied the case files. All 3 disappearances shared peculiar details: gear left behind, sudden loss of trail, and no physical evidence of injury or struggle. What puzzled investigators most was how quickly each person seemed to vanish. Search teams in 1985 and 1991 reported that scent trails from tracking dogs abruptly ended at nearly identical points along the ridge. It was as if each person had stepped off the trail and vanished into the air. The morning McAllister left for Welch Ridge was clear and cold. He carried standard equipment, a radio, map, compass, GPS receiver, and emergency supplies, and hiked steadily for several hours before reaching the section known locally as Deadline Ridge, a narrow, forested saddle flanked by steep slopes. It was here, just after noon, that his compass needle began to behave strangely. At first, it drifted slowly off north by about 15 degrees. Then, over the next few minutes, it swung in wide arcs before locking south the exact opposite direction. Thinking his compass might be defective, McAllister pulled out his backup. It did the same thing. The GPS unit, which had been reading normally all morning, froze on a set of coordinates and refused to update despite clear satellite visibility. This phenomenon, known as magnetic declination shift, can occur naturally when magnetic minerals in the underlying bedrock interfere with instruments. In most cases, the effect is minor, but here it was extreme. McAllister later wrote in his incident report that both compass needles rotated continuously in slow circles, never stabilizing. Even his analog watch, which had kept perfect time for years, stopped for nearly 30 seconds before ticking forward again. Despite these anomalies, he continued on, marking his position with flagging tape to prevent disorientation. Less than 300 yards farther along the ridge, he came across something unexpected: a torn length of nylon fabric caught on a low branch, weathered and sun-bleached from years of exposure. Nearby, under a layer of pine needles, he found a small aluminum tent stake the kind commonly sold in the early 1980 seconds. Both items were consistent with gear carried by Lisa Warren, but neither could be definitively linked to her. The discovery renewed questions about the area. If Lisa or the Morton brothers had passed through here, why had search teams missed these items during earlier sweeps? Had they been overlooked, or had they been moved since? Rangers collected them as evidence, but lab analysis provided no new leads. McAllister's equipment never returned to normal that afternoon. His radio signal weakened to static, even within line of sight range of a repeater station. When he tried to call in his position, dispatch could not triangulate his location. Eventually, he was forced to navigate back by following his own flagged markers. The moment he descended below the ridge's high point, his compass stabilized, his GPS corrected itself, and radio communications returned. Park officials later brought in geologists to study the ridge. They confirmed that the underlying rock contained unusually high concentrations of magnetite, a mineral capable of distorting magnetic instruments. In most circumstances, this would be an interesting but harmless geological feature. But combined with dense tree cover, steep slopes, and sudden weather changes, it created a dangerous environment for navigation. Even with that explanation, many questions remained. None of the missing hikers should have been in serious danger. All were experienced, properly equipped, and familiar with the terrain. And even if they had become disoriented, search teams should have found evidence of them within a reasonable radius. Yet, in all three cases, there were no footprints beyond a certain point. No dropped gear, and no remains, nothing but vanishing scent trails and broken compass needles. The park's investigative division eventually concluded that disorientation, possibly combined with hypothermia or a fall, was the most likely cause. But unofficially, many rangers remained unconvinced. Several reported similar compass malfunctions in the same area during later patrols, often accompanied by short bursts of radio static or sudden drops in barometric readings. In one case, a drone deployed for mapping lost signal and spiraled down into a ravine recovered days later, with no sign of mechanical failure. Today, Welch Ridge remains one of the least visited sections of the Smokies. Most hikers stick to the lower trails, avoiding the high saddle where compasses spin and signals fade. Those who venture there do so cautiously, marking their routes and keeping close track of time. Few linger, fewer still spend the night. The nylon scrap and tent stake recovered by McAllister remain in the park's evidence, archived silent fragments of a story that has no ending. They are the only physical clues ever found in a region that has claimed 3 lives and offered nothing in return. And every so often, when the air pressure dips or the magnetic field shifts just right, a compass needle on Welch Ridge still swings without reason, pointing not north, not south, but somewhere between the two, toward a place where trails fade, signals fail, and people disappear. The hollow that swallowed sound. In the summer of 2004, a seasoned search and rescue coordinator named Karen Holt led a team into a secluded section of the Great Smoky Mountains, known to rangers as Mill Hollow. The name rarely appeared on visitor maps, and most hikers never heard of it, a deep forested basin lying miles from any main trail, carved by an ancient watercourse that had long since dried into a network of mossy gullies and silent ravines. It was a place few entered deliberately, and almost none stayed after dark. But that July, Mill Hollow became the centre of one of the park's strangest disappearances, one that raised questions not about where a missing person had gone, but about whether anyone could have heard them if they had called for help. The incident began on July 18, when 3 two-year-old day hiker Matthew Blake set off from the Deep Creek trailhead for what he told friends would be a 6-hour trek through the backcountry. Blake was an experienced outdoorsman from Virginia, familiar with the Smokies, and comfortable with long solo hikes. He carried a small pack, a radio, and a whistle standard safety gear, and had left a detailed plan with his family. His intended route was simple: follow the Nolan Divide Trail, cut across to a little-used spur, and return by late afternoon. By nightfall, he had not returned. Friends contacted the park service, and by dawn, the search was underway. Teams began along his planned route and spread outward. At first, the signs were encouraging. About 4 miles from the trailhead, searchers found a water bottle wedged under a root, likely dropped accidentally. A quarter mile beyond that, they discovered a partial footprint near a dry creek bed, consistent with Blake's hiking boots. But after that, the trail went cold. Dogs were brought in and immediately followed a scent downhill toward Mill Hollow. The basin is notoriously difficult to navigate a steep descent choked with rhododendron and fallen hemlocks, the ground uneven and often waterlogged. The dogs lost the scent partway down the slope, but search teams continued deeper. By late afternoon, they had established a command post at the base of the hollow. That was when the first strange reports came in. Team members noted that sound seemed off. Shouts carried only a few yards before vanishing into the trees. Whistles sounded muted, as though blown through layers of cloth. Radio transmissions, normally clear within line of sight, were garbled or cut out entirely. Helicopter crews reported similar issues overhead, loud rotor noise that seemed to diminish abruptly when passing above the basin. At first, these observations were dismissed as tricks of topography. Deep, forested hollows can bend and dampen sound, especially when humidity is high. But over the next 2 days, the phenomenon grew harder to ignore. Ground crews attempting to coordinate by whistle, a standard practice in dense terrain, found that calls often went unheard, even when the teams were within 200 feet of each other. Shouts faded inexplicably. Some rescuers claimed they could not even hear the helicopters circling overhead, despite clear skies and open canopies. By day 3, Mill Hollow had become the focal point of the search. Teams swept it in concentric circles, leaving markers every 20 yards. They searched streambeds, probed thickets, and rappelled into deeper fissures where runoff had carved narrow channels through the soil. Despite these efforts, no trace of Matthew Blake appeared. The silence grew more unsettling with time. On the morning of July 22, Holt herself attempted a whistle test. Standing at the base of the hollow, she blew 3 sharp bursts on a rescue whistle. 2 colleagues stationed only 50 yards away heard nothing. Repeating the test with a radio produced similar results transmissions that appeared on the receiver, but with volumes so faint they were barely audible. Acoustic specialists, later consulted by the park, offered partial explanations. Mill Hollow's bowl-shaped topography, combined with dense foliage and saturated air, could scatter and absorb sound waves rather than reflecting them. Temperature inversions when cooler air is trapped near the ground by a layer of warm air above can bend sound upward, carrying it away from listeners. Under the right conditions, this could create zones where noise effectively skips over the landscape, leaving pockets of eerie quiet. But even with those explanations, the intensity of the effect was unusual. It was not just that shouts were faint in some areas, they vanished completely. Helicopter rotors, normally audible for miles, faded to a low hum and then silence as they passed overhead. Rangers compared notes and found that none of them had experienced sound suppression this complete in any other part of the park. The search continued for 11 days. Hundreds of volunteers joined the effort, combing every accessible part of Mill Hollow and the surrounding ridges. They dragged streambeds, deployed thermal imaging cameras, and even lowered microphones into narrow cracks in the ground, hoping to detect signs of movement or breathing. All they found were a few broken branches and a torn piece of fabric, possibly from Blake's shirt, snagged on a root near the base of the hollow. Beyond that, nothing. The official operation was suspended on July 30. Matthew Blake was never found. His case remains open, his final location marked only by a few scattered clues and the testimony of searchers who swore they were shouting into a void. Today, Mill Hollow is still avoided by most visitors. It does not appear on most park maps, and few trails pass close to its rim. Rangers enter only when necessary, and even then, they do so in pairs, leaving flagging tape at regular intervals to avoid disorientation. Some speak of the place in hushed tones, not as haunted, but as wrong, a landscape where the normal rules of sound and space no longer apply. Hikers who stray too close sometimes report strange experiences. Voices from companions a short distance away sound far off. A dog's bark seems to come from above rather than ahead. Radios crackle with silence. And somewhere within that basin, beneath the canopy and the moss-covered stones, the unanswered calls for Matthew Blake still seem to linger, unheard, unanswered, and lost to a hollow that swallows sound. The map that led nowhere. In the autumn of 1987, 4-year-old geographer and amateur historian Richard Holbrook arrived in the Great Smoky Mountains with a plan that combined his two passions, hiking and cartography. Holbrook was known among friends as a meticulous researcher, a man who collected antique survey maps and spent his weekends tracing forgotten routes through the Appalachian backcountry. He had recently acquired a rare 1,936 topographic map of the Smokies, one produced just before the national park was officially dedicated. The map, drawn from survey data predating many modern trails, showed landmarks and features that no longer appeared on current maps. One in particular caught Holbrook's attention, a marked clearing deep in the backcountry, labelled simply Survey Station L23. To Holbrook, this was irresistible. The clearing was not referenced in any contemporary guidebook or database, and satellite imagery revealed nothing unusual at the coordinates. Determined to investigate, he planned a solo expedition to locate the old survey site. He told his wife he expected to be gone 2 days, hiking in from the Kephart Prong trailhead and exiting near Bradley Fork. He carried standard gear: a tent, a compass, water, food, and the prized 1,936 map tucked carefully into a waterproof sleeve. On the morning of October 14, Holbrook parked his car and signed the trail register. Several hikers saw him that afternoon near Hughes Ridge, where he stopped briefly to consult his map before continuing northeast. The weather was clear and visibility good. He appeared confident and well prepared. That was the last confirmed sighting of him. When he did not return by October 16, his wife reported him missing. Rangers launched a search immediately, beginning along his planned route. Within 24 hours, they located his boot prints near a known trail junction. But then, curiously, the prints veered sharply off the established path and into untracked forest. Searchers followed them for nearly a mile before they stopped abruptly at a small clearing. There were no signs of a fall, no struggle, and no indication that he had doubled back. Beyond that point, the forest floor was undisturbed. The clearing itself matched, almost perfectly, the location marked as L23 on Holbrook's 1,936 map. Yet according to modern surveys, no such feature should have existed. There was no trace of any old survey marker, no stone cairn, no rusted equipment. The land sloped gently downward, covered in young beech and maple, as if no human had set foot there in decades. But one detail struck searchers as peculiar. At the clearing's centre was a shallow depression, roughly circular, about 8 feet across, not natural, but not clearly man-made either. Investigators speculated that Holbrook might have become disoriented, confusing the 1,936 map's coordinates with his own. But when they overlaid the old survey data with current GPS readings, the match was exact. The lost clearing existed precisely where the map said it would, even if nothing else did. The search continued for 2 weeks. Teams used infrared scanners, grid searches, and even metal detectors, hoping to locate an old survey marker or buried equipment. Nothing turned up. Dogs brought in from Tennessee followed a faint scent trail leading east from the clearing for about 300 yards, then lost it entirely. Theories began to circulate. Some believed Holbrook had fallen into one of the steep ravines that cut through the region and been buried by soil or vegetation. Others speculated he might have continued, following the 1,936 map's features, many of which no longer corresponded to modern terrain and wandered far from his intended route. But searchers covered every possible path for miles around with no sign of him. A more unusual hypothesis emerged from cartographers who examined the old survey. They noted that the coordinates for L23 did not correspond perfectly to the current geodetic grid, a discrepancy likely caused by differences in survey methods and reference points. If Holbrook had relied entirely on the old map, he might have been navigating a landscape that existed only relative to 1,930 seconds measurements. In other words, the map and the land might never have aligned in the way he believed. But that explanation didn't resolve the deeper mystery. Why his footprint stopped abruptly at the clearing, why the dog's scent trail ended in the middle of dense forest, or why no trace of him clothing, gear, or body was ever found. By the time the search ended, more than 60 square miles of wilderness had been examined. Nothing surfaced. Holbrook's tent, backpack, and the 1,936 map were never recovered. His disappearance became another entry in the park's long list of unresolved cases, one made stranger by the fact that investigators had a specific destination to search and still found nothing. Today, hikers occasionally visit the spot where Survey Station L23 was marked. It remains a nondescript patch of forest, quiet, overgrown, and unremarkable. There is no marker, no evidence of survey work, and no sign that anyone vanished there. Only the faint outline of the shallow depression remains, half buried under decades of leaf fall. For rangers who worked the case, it remains one of the most unsettling disappearances in Smoky Mountain history. It was not a case of a hiker losing his way or a search team failing to find a body. It was a disappearance centered on a single point, a destination that once appeared on a map but no longer exists, a place where evidence stops and the forest begins. Decades later, the mystery lingers. The 1,936 map is still stored in the park's archives, its faded ink marking a clearing that no one can explain. And somewhere beyond that point, whether deep beneath the soil, far off trail, or in a place no map can reach, Richard Holbrook's final steps end, where the map itself does, in a clearing that leads nowhere. The hill that pulled sideways. It was a calm afternoon in April 2022 when brothers Caleb and Ryan Barrett, along with their friend Jamie Liu, set out to hike a little-known spur off the Deep Creek Trail. The three were avid explorers of the Smokies, preferring paths few others followed, and this one was barely a path at all, an old game trail that wound through rhododendron thickets and emerged onto a gentle, grassy slope known locally as Hollow Ridge. The hill, though unremarkable in appearance, had a reputation among park rangers. It was not marked on any map, not listed in any guide, yet hikers who wandered too far onto it reported strange sensations, dizziness, a subtle sideways pull, and the odd feeling that their balance was being drawn towards something they could not see. Most dismissed it as exhaustion or imagination. The Barretts wanted to see if the stories were true. For the first 2 miles, nothing unusual happened. The sun was warm, the forest quiet. But as they stepped onto the slope just before 3 p.m, All three felt it at once, a faint tug, not forward or back, but sideways, toward the east. Ryan described it later as like being gently pulled by a slow-moving river. Jamie said it felt as if the ground was leaning, even though it was visibly flat. Caleb tried to take a straight step and veered several inches to the right. They laughed at first, assuming it was their imagination. But within minutes, the pull grew stronger. Their strides slanted without them meaning to. When they stopped walking, their bodies seemed to list slightly in the same direction, as if their inner balance had shifted. By 3:20, Ryan decided to turn back, but Caleb wanted to continue a little farther. The slope ahead dipped into a stand of spruce, and he said he wanted a look at the view from there. He promised to rejoin them in 5 minutes. He never did. When the two returned to the ridgeline, Caleb was gone. They called out for him, expecting an answer from just beyond the trees, but the forest remained silent. After 20 minutes of searching, they radioed for help. Search and rescue teams arrived within hours and began a grid search of the hillside. What they found puzzled them. Caleb's footprints, clear and distinct, showed a steady progression across the slope. Then, without warning, they curved sharply eastward, as though he had been pulled off course. From that point on, they became erratic, looping and overlapping, before vanishing altogether in a patch of undisturbed grass. There were no signs of a fall or struggle, no broken branches, no trail leading downhill. It was as if he had stepped sideways into the air. Geologists and atmospheric scientists who later studied the area proposed several explanations. The most plausible was lateral soil creep, a phenomenon in which the slow, nearly imperceptible movement of soil down a slope can create a sensation of sideways pull underfoot. Combined with a shifting water table and saturated ground from spring rains, Hollow Ridge might have been subtly shifting beneath the hiker's feet, creating the illusion of movement even on stable terrain. But soil creep usually occurs over months or years, not minutes. Another hypothesis focused on Coriolis illusions, disorienting sensations caused when the inner ear detects lateral acceleration that the eyes do not perceive. Such illusions can occur when multiple sensory systems' balance, vision, and proprioception fall slightly out of sync, often triggered by unusual terrain geometry or magnetic field variations. Instruments brought to the site confirmed that the area exhibited mild but measurable magnetic declination anomalies. Compass needles deviated up to 5 degrees east without a clear geological source. Subtle shifts in the Earth's magnetic field can interfere with the vestibular system, scientists explained, possibly creating the sensation of sideways pull. Yet neither theory explained the abrupt disappearance. The slope was open and visible for hundreds of feet in every direction. If Caleb had simply walked out of sight, searchers should have found him within hours. Instead, nothing turned up. Not his pack, not his camera, not a single piece of gear. Dogs followed his scent 300 yards downslope, then lost it in a clearing with no visible exit. One of the most curious discoveries came from a small accelerometer attached to Caleb's hiking pole, part of a fitness tracking system he'd been testing. The data, retrieved from cloud storage days later, showed a sudden and unexplained lateral acceleration spike at 3:23 p.m., the exact moment he vanished. The force, measured at roughly 0.8 meters per square second, was too weak to knock him down but strong enough to shift his center of gravity significantly. For comparison, that's roughly the sideways acceleration you might feel if someone gently shoved you while standing still. Speculation multiplied. Some researchers proposed a localized gravitational anomaly caused by a dense subsurface feature, possibly a buried iron deposit or a cavity altering the gravity field. Though such variations are typically tiny, a measurable anomaly could, in theory, create subtle but noticeable shifts in balance. Others pointed to geomagnetic jerk events, sudden, unpredictable changes in the Earth's magnetic field that have been known to occur without warning. If such an event coincided with the hike, it could explain both the magnetic readings and the vestibular disorientation. Despite weeks of searching, Caleb Barrett was never found. Rangers expanded the search radius to nearly 10 miles, scanning every drainage, ridge and hollow. Nothing emerged. The official report lists his case simply, "Subject vanished from known location under unknown conditions." Today, Hollow Ridge remains one of the Smokies' most quietly unsettling locations. Most hikers pass by without incident. But some, not many, but enough report the same odd sensation. A subtle pull, a drift in their step, a momentary feeling that gravity has shifted slightly sideways. Some stop and turn back immediately. Others, like Caleb, press forward and are never seen again. The slope itself remains unchanged, gentle and green beneath the filtered light. Yet the sensation lingers, faint but undeniable, as if the land itself remembers which way it wants you to go, and once you step too far in that direction, you cannot step back. The Great Smoky Mountains are more than a stretch of wilderness. They are a place where the ordinary rules of nature, time, space, gravity, even the weight of the air can shift without warning. Radios fail in perfect weather. Trails bend back on themselves. People step forward and never return. Scientists try to measure it, to explain it, to give shape to what happens here, but the mountains offer no answers. Only patterns and disappearances, and the quiet suggestion that we still understand far less about the natural world than we think. If you've found these stories as unsettling and as fascinating as we have, there's more to uncover. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and join us as we follow more of the strange, unexplained, and forgotten mysteries hidden in the most ordinary corners of our planet. Join us and step a little deeper into the unknown.